The courtroom was unusually crowded that morning. Every seat on the wooden benches had been taken, the air heavy with whispers, murmurs, and the occasional cough as people settled in. The fluorescent lights above cast a sterile glow across the polished floor, reflecting the solemnity of the proceedings. Outside, reporters had already gathered, their cameras ready to capture whatever would unfold inside. This was not just another trial. This was the case everyone in the county was talking about. At the heart of it sat a man accused of unthinkable crimes. His presence alone cast a shadow over the room. Dressed in a pressed suit, he carried himself with the kind of arrogance that comes from believing you might escape justice. The jurors shifted uneasily whenever their eyes met his. He leaned back in his chair, smirking occasionally at the defense attorney's whispered reassurances. But beneath the surface of his composure, there was a flicker of something darker fear. Across the room, the prosecutor shuffled papers, her lips tight, her eyes darting to the entrance of the courtroom. She knew the risk of today's decision. Everyone did. It wasn't evidence that would make or break the case. It was testimony. And not from an experienced adult or a trained officer, but from a 3-year-old child. The bailiff's voice rang out, firm and commanding. All rise. The judge entered, robes flowing as he made his way to the bench. His expression was stern, his eyes sharp behind his glasses. He had presided over countless cases in his career, but today was different. There was skepticism in his gaze. Could a toddler really be allowed to testify? Could justice rest on words spoken by someone so young? He adjusted his seat, the gavel striking once to silence the crowd. "This court is now in session," he announced. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. Then came the sound of soft footsteps. A small figure appeared at the courtroom doors. Lily. She was tiny, almost swallowed by the oversized dress her mother had chosen for her. In her hand, she clutched a worn-out stuffed bunny, its ears frayed from countless nights of comfort. Her big brown eyes darted nervously around the room as her mother guided her gently forward. But Lily wasn't alone. Walking faithfully beside her, on a short lead held by a uniformed officer, was Rex the police K9, a massive German shepherd. With a black and tan coat, Rex's presence commanded attention immediately. His ears were erect, his steps steady, his golden eyes sweeping the room as though already assessing threats. The crowd straightened instinctively. There was something about him that radiated both power and protection. The judge raised an eyebrow. "The court has permitted the presence of a support animal," he explained, perhaps more to himself than to the audience. "Let's proceed." Lily's small legs wobbled slightly as she climbed onto the witness chair, her mother adjusting the seat so she could see over the table. Rex settled right at her feet, his body pressed close enough that Lily could reach down if she wanted reassurance. His breathing was steady, rhythmic, a quiet anchor against the storm of stares directed at her. For a moment, the entire courtroom softened. Even the hardest expressions among the jurors shifted as they took in the fragile child, sitting with her bunny in one hand and the powerful dog by her side. It was an image that struck at the heart, innocence and loyalty, side by side, about to face the weight of justice. The defense attorney, however, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. To him, this was a circus act. A 3-year-old? He muttered to his client, "This won't hold. No jury will take her seriously." But the prosecutor knew better. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing that the child's voice, though small, might be the most powerful weapon in the case. Still, she worried. What if Lily froze? What if the defense managed to rattle her? What if the weight of the courtroom silenced her truth? The judge cleared his throat. "Young lady, do you understand why you're here today?" His tone was gentler than usual, an uncharacteristic softness in his voice. Lily's eyes widened, her lips pressing tightly together. She didn't answer. She clutched her bunny closer, her little knuckles turning white. Her mother whispered softly, "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe. Rex is here with you." At the mention of his name, Rex lifted his head and looked up at Lily. His tail gave the faintest wag, barely noticeable, but enough to catch her attention. Lily's tiny hand instinctively reached down, brushing against his thick fur. A visible calm washed over her shoulders. The jurors noticed. So did the prosecutor. Rex leaned just slightly into her touch, as though silently reminding her, "I'm here. You're not alone." The judge observed the interaction, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. This wasn't the typical role of a canine in court. He had seen them guard evidence, assist officers, even control unruly defendants. But here, the dog wasn't acting as a weapon or an enforcer. He was a shield, a wall of trust between the fragile child and the intimidating world of the courtroom. "Proceed," the judge said finally. The prosecutor approached the witness. "Stand," her heels clicking softly on the tile. She crouched slightly to be eye level with Lily. "Hi, Lily," she said gently. "Do you remember me? We talked before, remember?" Lily gave the faintest nod, still clutching Rex with her other hand. "Good," the prosecutor continued. "Can you tell us your name?" Another pause. The courtroom held its breath. Even the defense attorney leaned forward slightly, waiting. Finally, Lily whispered, "Lily." The word was soft, almost lost in the large room, but the microphone caught it. The sound of her voice, small and innocent, echoed through the speakers, settling over the jurors like a fragile thread of truth. The prosecutor smiled warmly. "That's right, Lily." She glanced at Rex. "And who is this sitting by your side?" Lily's lips trembled, but then she looked down at the German shepherd. This time her voice was a little stronger. "Rex?" The dog gave a small chuff, as if acknowledging the introduction. A ripple of soft chuckles spread across the gallery, breaking some of the tension. Even the judge allowed the corners of his mouth to twitch upward. But beneath the lightness, the weight of what was about to happen remained heavy. The prosecutor straightened and turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just met Lily. She's only 3 years old, but she was there the night everything happened. She saw what most of us can only imagine. Today, she's going to help us understand the truth. And Rex," she gestured toward the canine, "is here to make sure she feels safe enough to do so." The defense attorney immediately objected. "This is highly irregular. A child this age cannot reliably testify in the presence of a police. Dog creates undue influence on the jury." The judge held up a hand. "Objection noted. Overruled for now. We will allow the testimony. Continue." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing the gravity of the moment. This was history in the making. Lily sat quietly, her small chest rising and falling as she gathered courage. Rex shifted, pressing closer to her chair, his presence unshakable. She stroked his head with her tiny fingers, grounding herself. The courtroom waited. And in that suspended silence, every single person realized something extraordinary. This trial no longer belonged to lawyers or judges or the man accused. It belonged to a child and her dog. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. All eyes were fixed on the little girl in the witness chair. She looked impossibly small against the towering oak furniture, the microphone looming like a strange mechanical flower beside her. Lily clutched her stuffed bunny tighter, pressing it against her chest as though it could shield her from the countless stares. Her mother sat in the front row, leaning forward, her lips moving in silent encouragement. "You can do this, sweetheart. You're safe." Rex, the German shepherd, remained at her side, sprawled protectively across her feet. His ears twitched at every sound, every shuffle, every cough in the gallery. His steady presence was the only thing anchoring Lily. She kept her hand on his fur, running her fingers through the thick coat whenever her courage faltered. The prosecutor, Miss Reynolds, adjusted her stance and spoke softly. "Lily, I know this is a big room, and there are a lot of people here, but right now, it's just you and me, okay? You don't need to be afraid. Do you remember when we talked before?" Lily nodded slowly, though her eyes never left Rex. "That's good," Miss Reynolds encouraged. She crouched a little so she wasn't towering over the child. "We're just talking again today, like before. And Rex is here too, to make sure you're safe." The dog gave a soft sigh, resting his massive head on Lily's shoe. She bent slightly and touched his ear, her lips forming the faintest smile. The defense attorney, Mr. Carver, rolled his eyes dramatically. "Your Honor, I must again object the theatrics of this entire arrangement. This child is 3 years old. She can't possibly understand the gravity of an oath or the seriousness of testimony. This is nothing more than a performance." The judge, who had been quietly watching Lily, lifted his gaze toward Carver. His voice was firm but calm. "The objection is noted. The court will allow this testimony under special consideration, given the unique circumstances. Proceed, Miss Reynolds, but tread carefully." Carver sat down with a frustrated huff, whispering furiously to his client. The defendant smirked, leaning closer. "She won't say a word," he murmured. "Too young, too scared, but across." The room, Miss Reynolds leaned toward the witness stand, with patience etched into her face. She understood that pressuring Lily would only backfire. Children this age lived in a world of trust and instinct. Forcing her to perform for the courtroom would only deepen her silence. "Lily," she began gently, "can you tell me who's sitting beside you?" The girl blinked, glancing down at Rex. "Rex," she whispered. "Rex," Miss Reynolds repeated, smiling. "That's right. And Rex is very brave, isn't he?" The tiniest nod. "Do you know why Rex is here with you today?" A pause. Lily's fingers twisted the ear of her stuffed bunny, and for a moment Miss Reynolds thought she might retreat into silence again. But then, without looking up, Lily said, "So I'm not scared." The room collectively inhaled. The honesty of the statement pierced through the layers of formality and law. This wasn't rehearsed. This wasn't coached. It was the raw truth of a child who had seen too much and was trying to find her footing in a world that suddenly seemed too large. Even some jurors shifted uncomfortably, blinking quickly as though her words had reached them in places legal arguments never could. Ms. Reynolds nodded warmly. "That's right. Rex is here so you don't have to be scared. And I promise, nothing bad will happen to you here. Everyone in this room wants to hear your truth, Lily. We just need you to help us understand. Can you do that?" The little girl's eyes lifted for the first time, scanning the jury box nervously. A dozen faces stared back, some kind, some skeptical. She quickly looked away, pressing herself closer to Rex. The German shepherd shifted slightly, nudging her hand with his nose, as though reminding her that she wasn't facing them alone. The judge leaned forward, his hand resting under his chin. He wasn't smiling anymore. Instead, he wore the expression of a man trying to measure something profound, the fragile balance between a child's innocence and the immense responsibility of justice. Miss Reynolds continued, carefully choosing her words. "Lily, can you tell us about the night you and Mommy were at the park?" Carver jumped to his feet, leading the witness. "This is outrageous. You cannot simply plant a narrative in a 3-year-old's mouth." The judge turned his gaze toward him, his voice sharp. "Mr. Carver, sit down. The court will permit latitude in questioning, given the age of the witness." Overruled. The defense attorney sat with a visible scowl, but he didn't push further. All attention returned to Lily, her lips pressed together, her brow furrowed as she wrestled with her memory. For a 3-year-old, words were still new, slippery things. But feelings, those she remembered vividly. Her mother clasped her hands in her lap, her eyes wet. She wanted desperately to run to her daughter, to pull her into her arms and protect her from the weight of so many expectant eyes. But she couldn't, not now. Justice depended on her child finding her voice. Lily leaned closer to Rex. She whispered something too softly for the microphone to catch, but the dog's ears twitched, his head rising attentively. The gallery stilled. People strained forward, desperate to hear what she had said. Ms. Reynolds caught the moment and adjusted the microphone slightly. "Sweetheart, can you say that a little louder? What did you tell Rex?" Lily's lips trembled. She glanced toward the defense table, where the man accused sat watching her intently. His eyes were dark, sharp, predatory. The moment their gazes met, Lily froze, her small hands trembling violently around her bunny. Rex reacted instantly. A low rumble vibrated from his chest, quiet but unmistakable. His golden eyes locked on the defendant, his body tense. The courtroom gasped at the sudden protective growl. "Order!" The judge barked, slamming his gavel. "Control your animal." The handler tugged gently on Rex's lead, whispering calming commands. The dog's growl faded, but his gaze never left the defendant. The atmosphere was electric, the tension so thick it felt like a storm about to break. Miss Reynolds steadied herself. She knew the moment was fragile. "Lily," she said softly, "it's okay. Look at Rex, not at anyone else. Just Rex. Can you tell him what you remember?" Lily's eyes dropped back to the dog. Her shoulders eased slightly. She bent forward, pressing her lips against his ear, whispering again. This time, the microphone caught it faintly, and the words slipped into the air like fragile glass. "Bad man." The words were soft, almost fragile, but they shattered the silence like thunder. Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. Jurors exchanged looks of shock. Reporters scribbled frantically. Even the judge's expression faltered, his mask of neutrality cracking for a heartbeat. The defendant stiffened, his smirk erased, his hands clenching against the table. Carver shot to his feet again. "Objection! Objection! This is inadmissible. A 3-year-old cannot." But the damage was done. Lily's words hung in the air, undeniable. Simple, pure, uncoached. She had not spoken to appease an attorney or a jury. She had spoken to Rex, the only one she trusted, and in doing so, she had spoken to everyone. The courtroom wasn't the same anymore. Something irreversible had been set in motion. The courtroom had not yet recovered from Lily's whispered words. "Bad man." 2 syllables spoken with childlike simplicity, yet they struck harder than any polished argument the attorneys could muster. Reporters scribbled furiously. The jury exchanged uneasy glances. Even the judge, long practiced at concealing emotion, lingered on the little girl with something bordering on awe. But Lily herself seemed oblivious to the chaos she had just created. After whispering those 2 words into Rex's ear, she tucked her face against his fur, as though hiding from the storm her voice had unleashed. The German shepherd remained, steady, his chest rising and falling in calm rhythm. Rex did not flinch under the scrutiny of the room. His amber eyes remained fixed forward, yet his entire body was angled protectively toward Lily. The unspoken bond between them was visible to everyone. Where she was small, fragile, and uncertain, he was large, grounded, and unmovable. Together, they were a single statement, innocence defended by loyalty. The judge tapped his gavel once, bringing order. "Proceed," he instructed, though his voice carried less authority than before. It was as if the balance of power had shifted, and the trial now revolved around the fragile child and her silent guardian. Ms. Reynolds, the prosecutor, recognized the shift. She softened her approach even further, careful not to overwhelm. "Lily, sweetheart," she said gently, crouching again so that her face was level with the child's. "You're very brave. Thank you for telling Rex what you remember." Lily didn't look at her. Instead, she stroked Rex's ear, twisting the fur between her fingers as though braiding courage from it. "Can you tell Rex a little more?" Ms. Reynolds asked. "You don't have to say it to me. Just tell Rex. He's listening." The jurors leaned forward, captivated. This wasn't just testimony. It was something deeper, something raw. The defense attorney, Carver, slammed his pen against the desk. "Your Honor, this is absurd. Testimony is not meant to be given to an animal." The judge didn't look at him. His eyes were on Lily. "Mr. Carver," he said evenly, "what we are hearing may be unorthodox, but the child is speaking. And when a witness speaks, the court listens." Overruled. Carver fell back into his chair, muttering under his breath. His client shifted uneasily beside him, his once confident smirk evaporating. He had underestimated the power of simplicity, the devastating impact of a child's truth paired with a dog's silent validation. Lily bent low, her lips moving against Rex's fur again. This time, the microphone picked up her soft voice. "He hurt Mommy." Gasps rippled through the courtroom again. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth with her hands. A juror pressed her fingers against her temple, blinking back tears. Rex remained steady, unshaken by the emotion around him. His eyes did not waver. His very presence acted as proof his instinct was honoring and his loyalty was absolute. Ms. Reynolds swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay composed. "Lily," she said carefully, "when you say he, do you mean the man sitting over there?" She pointed gently toward the defense table. The little girl didn't look up. Her small fingers curled tighter around Rex's ear. The German shepherd shifted, his body lowering slightly as though to cradle her. For a moment, she stayed frozen. Then, with hesitant bravery, she lifted one tiny finger and pointed in the same direction Ms. Reynolds had indicated. Her hand trembled, but her meaning was clear. The courtroom erupted again. The defendant stiffened visibly, his jaw tightening. For the first time, fear flickered openly across his face. Carver bolted upright. "This is outrageous. She's being led. She doesn't even understand the question. Sit down, mister." "Carver," the judge snapped, his gavel striking sharply. "The jury will determine the weight of her testimony. Your objections are becoming repetitive." The defense attorney's face flushed crimson. He sat heavily, slamming his files closed with a scowl. Meanwhile, Lily sank back against Rex, her courage expended for the moment. She buried her face in his neck, inhaling the familiar scent of his fur. Her stuffed bunny dangled forgotten from one hand. Rex shifted just enough to steady her, pressing his body more firmly against her chair. He let out a deep sigh, the sound vibrating through her tiny frame, grounding her. The courtroom grew still again. What everyone realized in that heavy silence was that Rex had become more than a support animal. He was a bridge. He was the reason Lily was able to speak at all. Without him, the fragile testimony would have collapsed under the weight of fear. One juror whispered softly to another, "It's like he's translating for her." And in many ways, he was. Ms. Reynolds recognized the power of the moment. She didn't push further. She stood slowly, letting Lily rest, and turned toward the jury. "You have seen it for yourselves." No adult told her what to say. No one rehearsed her answers. She is speaking in the only way she knows how, through trust. And that trust is placed in Rex. That dog has been trained for years to sense truth, to protect innocence. And today he has shown you something remarkable, that this little girl's words are not just words. They are truth. The defense bristled, but remained silent under the judge's glare. Lily shifted slightly, lifting her head. She whispered again to Rex, her small hand still pressed against his neck. This time the words carried faintly to the microphone. "Don't let him get me." The jurors froze. Several faces turned pale. Rex's ears flicked back, and he pressed his head firmly against her arm. His way of saying "I won't." The prosecutor blinked rapidly, struggling to compose herself. She glanced at the jury. Tears welled in one juror's eyes. Another shook his head slowly, as if fighting anger. The judge exhaled deeply. He removed his glasses, polished them with a cloth, and replaced them. His expression was different, not skeptical, not detached. There was weight in his gaze, the kind that comes from understanding that something extraordinary has just taken place. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, he said suddenly, striking his gavel. "We will reconvene shortly." The gallery buzzed as people rose. Reporters whispered frantically into their phones. Carver snapped at his client, his tone sharp with panic. But in the center of it all, Lily remained curled against Rex, the only calm point in a storm of voices. Her mother rushed forward, kneeling by the stand. "Sweetheart, you did so well," she whispered, brushing Lily's hair back. "You were so brave." But Lily didn't answer. She pressed her cheek deeper into Rex's fur, clinging to the steady heartbeat beneath. For her, the courtroom didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that Rex was there, and as long as he was, she wasn't completely alone. The German shepherd lifted his gaze across the room, his eyes locking briefly on the defendant. His ears flicked back, his body tense. But quiet. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. But the message in his gaze was clear. You won't touch her again. And everyone who saw it understood. This was no ordinary dog, and this was no ordinary testimony. The courtroom had been filled with countless tense moments since the trial began, but nothing compared to the quiet that fell when little Lily looked up from her seat. Her fingers clutched the ear of her stuffed bunny, her lips trembling as though words were fighting their way out. The prosecutor, leaning in gently, repeated his question with the patience of someone who knew the fragility of this moment. "Lily, do you remember who hurt you?" The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, already preparing to object. The jury leaned forward. Every reporter's pen hovered over paper. The air seemed too heavy for anyone to breathe. But Lily did not look at the lawyer. She did not look at the judge. Her eyes, round, innocent, untainted by the tricks of legal games, landed instead on the tall man sitting at the defense table, the accused. And then, almost instinctively, she leaned closer to Rex, the canine sitting by her side. Her tiny hand rested on his fur. The courtroom was so quiet that everyone could hear the faint brushing sound of her fingers against the German shepherd's coat. She whispered, so softly that at first only Rex seemed to hear. 2 words. "Bad man?" The silence broke like glass. Rex, ever vigilant, reacted instantly. His body stiffened, muscles tensing as a low, guttural growl rolled from his chest. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to echo across the chamber like thunder. The dog's reaction wasn't one of fear. It was protective, instinctive, primal. The defendant's smirk faltered. His jaw tightened. For the first time since the trial had started, his eyes flickered with something that looked a lot like fear. The gallery erupted. Gasps, whispers, the scratch of pens on paper as reporters scrambled to record what had just happened. The judge struck his gavel hard against the bench. Order, order in the court. But order was impossible. Not after that. Not after a 3-year-old, who had barely spoken above a whisper all morning, pointed across the room and named the man who had haunted her dreams. The defense attorney leapt to his feet. "Objection! This is highly improper. She's a toddler, Your Honor. She doesn't know what she's saying." But the damage was already done. Those 2 words, simple, raw, unfiltered, had carried more weight than hours of expert testimony. The jury had seen it. They had heard it. They had felt it. The prosecutor, sensing the momentum, remained calm. He didn't push Lily further. He didn't need to. He allowed the silence to linger, allowed those 2 words to take root in the minds of everyone present. The judge rubbed his temples, sighing. He was a man who had seen countless trials, countless performances, countless lies, but this wasn't theater. There was no manipulation in Lily's voice, no script in her hand, just truth. "Proceed carefully, counselor," the judge said. At last, his voice quieter than usual. The prosecutor leaned closer to Lily, his tone gentle, fatherly. "Lily, can you tell us why you called him that?" Lily blinked, her eyes watering. She hugged her stuffed bunny tight, as if squeezing strength out of it. She looked at Rex again, then nodded slightly. He hurt Mommy," she whispered. The room collectively inhaled. It wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was about her mother, the woman sitting in the gallery, tears streaming down her cheeks, trying to remain strong. The prosecutor's voice softened even further. "And how do you know that, sweetheart?" "Because I saw him," Lily answered, her little voice shaky but clear. "I saw him in our house." The defense attorney jumped again. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. This child is 3 years old. Her imagination cannot be considered reliable testimony." The judge silenced him with a single raised hand. "Sit down, counselor. The jury will decide what they find credible." The defense attorney sat, but his face was red, his confidence unraveling. He knew the power of first impressions. And Lily's had been devastating. The jury couldn't take their eyes off her. They weren't seeing a manipulative witness or a coached testimony. They were seeing a child innocent, uncoached, raw, telling the only truth she knew. Rex stayed by her side, his head slightly bowed as if standing guard. The growl he had released moments earlier lingered in everyone's minds. Canine officers were trained to control their reactions, to remain calm unless danger presented itself. For Rex to have responded so instinctively to Lily's words, it was almost as if he understood her better than any adult in the room. The handler sitting nearby didn't intervene. He simply watched his dog, knowing the bond between Rex and Lily had become something powerful, something beyond protocol. The prosecutor didn't push Lily further. He thanked her softly and asked the judge's permission for her to step down. The judge agreed, though his eyes lingered on her tiny frame as she walked back toward her mother. Rex padded beside her, protective until the last second. As Lily climbed into her mother's arms, the courtroom finally exhaled. The jurors scribbled notes furiously. The spectators whispered, their emotions raw. And the reporters knew they had just witnessed the moment that would define the case. 2 words. That was all it had taken. Yet the ripple of those 2 words didn't stop there. The prosecutor turned toward the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard from many witnesses. You have seen evidence. You have read reports. But today, you heard the most unfiltered testimony of all from a child who has no motive, no agenda, no reason to lie. She spoke the truth as she knows it. And even Rex, a highly trained canine officer, reacted instinctively. That is not coincidence. That is truth." The defense attempted to object again, but the judge overruled. The jury's faces said it all. They were listening. They were moved. The defendant sat stiffly, his composure slipping. For weeks, he had believed his lawyers. Strategies could save him, that evidence could be twisted, that adult witnesses could be discredited. But he had not anticipated this, a child's purity cutting through every defense like a knife. And the worst part? He knew she was right. The rest of the session was a blur of legal sparring, but the echo of Lily's words never left the room. Every time the defense spoke, the jurors seemed to return to that moment, the tiny voice, the trembling hand pointing across the room, the dog's low growl. It was more than testimony. It was human instinct. It was truth made flesh. By the time the session adjourned for the day, the atmosphere of the courtroom had completely shifted. Where there had once been doubt, there was now conviction. Where there had been hesitation, there was now certainty. Reporters rushed out of the building, eager to break the story. Child witness names defendant in court. The headlines would read, "Police dog reacts to girl's testimony." But for those who had been inside, it was more than just a headline. It was a moment none of them would ever forget. The judge returned to his chambers with a heavy heart, replaying the scene in his mind. He had presided over trials for decades, but this one would haunt him. Not because of the crime itself, but because of the courage it had taken for a 3-year-old to say 2 words that carried the weight of justice. The prosecutor, meanwhile, felt hope rising in his chest. He knew the case was far from over. More evidence needed to be presented. More witnesses needed to testify. But Lily's moment had pierced the veil of doubt. It had planted a seed of truth in the minds of the jury, a seed that the defense would never be able to uproot. And Lily? She rested peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware of the storm she had unleashed with her tiny voice. To her, she had simply told the truth. To the court, she had delivered a blow more powerful than any cross-examination. Rex sat at her feet, his eyes alert, his body relaxed now that his job was done. He didn't need to understand human words to know he had protected someone who needed him most. For him, it wasn't about evidence. It wasn't about justice. It was about loyalty. And in that moment, his loyalty and her innocence had joined forces to shake an entire courtroom to its core. The courtroom had barely recovered from the shock of Lily's 2 words. "Bad man," when chaos broke loose. The defense attorney leapt to his feet, his voice rising louder than it had all day. His polished shoes clicked against the hardwood floor as he approached the bench, his papers fluttering in his hand. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked, his voice tinged with desperation. "This testimony cannot be considered credible. The child is only 3 years old. She doesn't understand the gravity of her words. She's confused, frightened, and clearly influenced by the presence of the dog." The judge raised an eyebrow, but did not immediately reply. The prosecutor calmly adjusted his glasses, waiting for the storm to play itself out. Jurors shifted, uncomfortably in their seats, their faces showing traces of doubt, but also deep sympathy. Lily clutched Rex's thick fur tighter, burying her face against him. The K9's amber eyes remained locked on the defendant, unblinking, sharp, and unwavering. The air felt thick, like the entire courthouse was holding its breath. The defense attorney turned sharply, pointing a finger at the little girl. His voice trembled with manufactured outrage. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you cannot possibly take the words of a toddler as truth in a case of this magnitude. A child that young cannot discern reality from imagination. She could have been coached. She could have repeated something she overheard. We cannot let a man's life be destroyed because of 2 words whispered to a dog." The courtroom murmured. Some nodded, considering his point, but others shook their heads, unwilling to dismiss what they had seen with their own eyes. The prosecutor finally stood, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, may I respond?" The judge nodded. "Children this young may not know legal jargon," the prosecutor said, turning toward the jury, his voice steady, almost fatherly. "They may not fully understand procedures or courtrooms. But there is one thing children cannot fake at this age: fear. You all saw it. She didn't rehearse that moment. She didn't look to me or to her mother for guidance. She looked at the man who sits accused, and she told her truth in the only words her 3-year-old mind could manage. "Bad man?" He paused, letting the silence hang heavy. "And as for Rex," he continued, gesturing toward the K9, "he is not here to trick anyone. He is not a prop. He is a certified police dog, trained to comfort victims, detect lies, and sense danger. His reaction, his growl, was not random. It was instinctive. You saw it. He recognized her fear, and he responded. The truth is undeniable." The defense attorney sneered, his frustration bubbling over. "So now we're taking testimony from a dog? What's next? Will we have the animal take the stand?" His sarcastic words drew a few nervous chuckles from the audience, but most jurors remained stone-faced. They had seen something powerful, and sarcasm wasn't enough to erase it. The judge rapped his gavel for order. "Enough," he said sternly. "Both sides will stick to facts." The defendant shifted in his chair, the confident smirk he had worn earlier, now replaced by something else, fear. His jaw tightened, his hands twitched. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering furiously. But the whispers carried no weight. Against the image still burned into everyone's mind. A small child, trembling, pointing at him, calling him bad man as the dog confirmed her terror. The defense attorney regrouped, trying a new angle. His tone softened, now trying to sound reasonable. "Members of the jury, I urge you to remember that justice cannot be built on emotion alone. Yes, the child is frightened. Yes, her words tug at our hearts. But sympathy is not evidence. Fear is not proof. We must look at the facts, the tangible evidence. And the fact remains, no physical link ties my client directly to this accusation." He gestured toward the prosecutor's table. "They are. Relying on a child's fear and a dog's instincts. That is not justice, it is theater." Some jurors furrowed their brows, wrestling with his argument. But others stole glances at Lily, still curled up against Rex, her innocence so stark against the cold brutality of the man on trial. The prosecutor rose again. His voice was low, measured, but it carried the weight of conviction. "You heard the defense say that sympathy is not evidence. But truth spoken simply and without agenda is. A child this young does not concoct lies about trauma. They do not invent fear. And while she may not give you long speeches or technical details, what she did give you was raw honesty." He looked each juror in the eye. "Ask yourselves, did that little girl look coached? Did she hesitate before pointing at the man who hurt her? Or did she do exactly what children do when they feel unsafe, name the source of their fear?" The defense attorney slammed his hand on the desk. "This is outrageous. You're letting this trial devolve into a circus." But his voice sounded less commanding now, more desperate. The jurors were no longer leaning toward him. They were leaning away. He could feel his control slipping. The judge cleared his throat, his tone clipped. "Counselor, you've made your objections clear. The jury will decide what weight to give to the child's testimony. You may sit." The defense attorney hesitated, his face flushed red, but finally slumped back into his chair. His client's eyes darted nervously around the room, his confidence drained. The energy in the courtroom shifted. Where once there had been doubt, now there was belief. The prosecutor's words echoed in every mind. Children this young don't lie about trauma. The jurors, who had walked into the courtroom uncertain, now looked at Lily with new reverence. It wasn't about whether she could recite details like an adult witness. It was about the power of her truth, spoken in 2 trembling words, amplified by the unwavering loyalty of a dog who knew her fear was real. Rex shifted, his ears flicking, his gaze still locked on the defendant. His handler leaned down and whispered to him, but Rex didn't break his stare. It was as if he were silently testifying, reminding everyone of the child's honesty. The judge finally called for a recess. The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted into whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously, some rushing toward the hallway, to get their stories out before the news cycle closed. 3-year-old stuns courtroom with 2 words. Police dog growls at defendant, after child points him out. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Meanwhile, Lily sat quietly, her head still resting against Rex's fur. She had no idea of the storm she had unleashed, no understanding of how her small, trembling voice had shaken the foundation of a courtroom. To her, Rex was simply her friend, her protector. She had spoken the truth because it was all she knew. But for the defendant, her words were a crack in the armor he had worn for months. His smirk was gone, his bravado broken. He knew now he wasn't just fighting the prosecutor. He was fighting the undeniable truth spoken by a child and a dog, and that truth was winning. The defense attorney tried to mask his panic, but the jurors had seen it too. His arguments rang hollow, his theatrics transparent. The more he spoke, the more desperate he appeared. For the first time since the trial began, the balance had shifted. The power no longer belonged to the defense. It belonged to a little girl, a dog, and the truth they carried together. The courtroom would never be the same. And deep down, everyone knew the verdict was already beginning to take shape. The courtroom had not been prepared for silence so thick, so weighty that even the steady hum of the ceiling fan seemed intrusive. The image of little Lily pressing her cheek against the thick sable-colored fur of Rex lingered in every mind. The child's words, 2 simple syllables, "bad man," had rippled through the room like a stone thrown into glassy water, sending out waves that no one could ignore. But now, all eyes shifted to Rex. The German shepherd sat completely still, his body positioned directly between Lily and the defendant. His ears stood tall, his gaze locked with unwavering intensity on the man seated just feet away. To the untrained eye, Rex appeared calm, but those who had worked with K9 units knew better. His stance muscles taut, his chest rising and falling. With deliberate control spoke of focus, of instinct sharpening to a razor's edge. The defense attorney cleared his throat, attempting to brush aside the significance of what had just occurred. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice trembling slightly, though he tried to mask it with bravado. "We must remember that this is a trained animal. Dogs are conditioned to react to cues, to noises, to energy in the room. A growl is no testimony, it's a reflex." But his words rang hollow. The jurors' eyes flickered not toward the attorney, but back to Rex. The dog's steady, unblinking gaze carried a gravity far beyond the lawyer's argument. Even the judge, stern and disciplined after decades on the bench, found his attention lingering on the dog. He knew Rex wasn't just another animal. This was a police K9 partner, sworn to service, loyalty, and truth. And like any officer of the law, Rex's presence demanded respect. The handler, Sergeant Miller, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He hadn't expected Rex to growl. Trained K9 South were taught discipline above all else. They didn't react unless something was wrong. For Rex to break his composure in the courtroom, in front of the judge, jury, and public, meant one thing. His instincts had been triggered. And instincts like Rex's had saved lives before. The prosecutor, seizing the moment, turned toward Sergeant Miller. "Sergeant, you've worked with Rex for how many years now?" "5 years," Miller answered, his voice steady though. His hand rested firmly on Rex's harness, as if tethering himself to the dog's strength. "And in those 5 years, how often has he reacted inappropriately during official proceedings or assignments?" "Never," Miller said without hesitation. "Rex doesn't make mistakes." The room stirred with whispers. The defense attorney quickly objected, but the judge allowed the testimony to continue. "Can you explain?" the prosecutor pressed. "Why a trained canine like Rex would react in such a manner today?" Miller glanced at Rex, then at Lily, who had tucked herself against the dog's side as if he were a fortress. He chose his words carefully. "Canines are trained to read human behavior, the tones and voices, the sense of adrenaline, fear, even deceit. When Rex growls, it's not without cause. It's because he senses something dangerous, something wrong." A ripple of unease spread through the courtroom. Jurors leaned back in their seats, stealing glances at the defendant, whose face had begun to flush red. He shifted in his chair, tugging at his collar as though the air had grown too thick. The defense attorney sprang up, his voice sharp with desperation. "Objection. This is speculation. Dogs cannot provide testimony. They are animals." But the judge raised his hand, silencing him. "The jury will decide what weight to place on the observations of the canine officer," he said firmly. His eyes lingered on Rex. For a brief moment, he saw not just a dog, but an officer who carried with him an unshakable moral compass, one that human beings too often failed to uphold. The silence returned, heavier this time, pressing down on everyone. Lily broke it. She lifted her head, her tiny hand still, clutching Rex's fur. Her eyes, large and unblinking, moved from the dog to the man seated at the defense table. The same man who now sat shifting uncomfortably, his smirk from earlier completely gone. Her voice, soft but steady, carried across the courtroom once more. "Rex knows. He knows." The jury gasped. Those 3 words landed like a hammer blow. The defendant's hands clenched on the table, his jaw tightening. His lawyer whispered urgently into his ear, but the man didn't respond. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the child, who had just spoken with a certainty that no adult could. "Challenge." The prosecutor let the silence stretch, knowing the power of what had just unfolded. Then, gently, he asked, "Lily, why do you think Rex knows?" The child didn't hesitate. "Because he was there. He remembers too. He remembers." "The bad man." Murmurs erupted in the gallery, some muffled cries echoing off the walls. The judge struck his gavel for order, but even he couldn't deny the impact. It wasn't just a child's testimony anymore. It was something deeper, an unexplainable bond between a little girl and a dog who had both survived the shadows of fear. The defense attorney stood again, sweat glistening on his forehead. "This is absurd," he snapped. "We cannot allow this courtroom to be swayed by the theatrics of a child and an animal. This is not evidence, it's manipulation." But as he spoke, his voice cracked, betraying his own unease. Because he, too, had felt the weight of Rex's growl. He, too, had seen the way Lily's small body relaxed only when she was near. The canine. And somewhere, deep in the part of his mind he dared not acknowledge, he believed them. The judge leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "Perhaps, counselor, it is not the courtroom being manipulated. Perhaps it is being shown a truth in the purest form possible, unfiltered, uncoached, undeniable." Every juror's eyes flicked toward the defendant. Some nodded almost imperceptibly. The tide had turned, and it was no longer just about the facts on paper. It was about instinct, about honesty that couldn't be rehearsed. The prosecutor, sensing victory, gave his closing question. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've seen a child who cannot lie about what she endured. You've seen a canine officer, trained to protect and serve, respond instinctively to her truth. Ask yourselves, is this coincidence? Or is this justice? Speaking in its most unshakable form?" The words hung in the air, reverberating with undeniable force. Rex, as if understanding the gravity of the moment, shifted closer to Lily, pressing his head gently against her tiny shoulder. The child wrapped her arms around his neck, her eyes closing in comfort. To the jury, it wasn't a scene of theatrics. It was raw, unfiltered truth delivered not through legal jargon, but through the bond of loyalty, innocence, and instinct. And the defendant, for the first time, looked afraid. Truly afraid. Because no matter how skilled his lawyer, no matter how much evidence he tried to dispute, he was facing something he couldn't outwit, couldn't intimidate, and couldn't silence. He was facing the testimony of a child's heart and a dog's unshakable loyalty. And together, they were stronger than any lie he had ever told. The gavel struck again. "We will recess until tomorrow," the judge announced, though his voice carried an edge of emotion he rarely allowed to show. "Court is adjourned." As the jurors filed out, many of them looked back not at the lawyers, not at the defendant, but at Lily and Rex, and in those glances it was clear. Verdict was already written in their hearts. The moment Lily's small voice uttered those two unforgettable words, "Bad man," the courtroom seemed to lose all sense of time. Her declaration, accompanied by Rex's low, protective growl, rippled through the walls like thunder rolling across the mountains. It was not a carefully rehearsed statement crafted by lawyers, nor a coerced testimony shaped by adult influence. It was pure, unfiltered truth from the heart of a child. The kind of truth that pierced through doubt, leaving no space for anyone to hide behind technicalities or excuses. Lily, still perched on the witness chair that seemed far too big for her tiny frame, lowered her gaze. She did not fully grasp the magnitude of what she had just done, but instinctively she leaned against Rex. The German shepherd, strong and steady, shifted closer until his body touched hers, providing a wall of comfort and reassurance. Her trembling stopped as she buried her fingers in the thick fur of his neck. For Lily, the scariest part was over. She had spoken, and Rex had not left her side. The jurors, a collection of men and women with varied lives, sat in stunned silence. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats, not because they doubted Lily, but because they were overwhelmed by the weight of what had just happened. Some jurors discreetly dabbed their eyes, unwilling to let emotions betray their professionalism. Yet, it was impossible to ignore the sincerity of a child who had just pointed directly at the defendant and uttered two words that carried more impact than hours of adult testimony. The judge, a man with decades of courtroom experience, sat frozen for a beat longer than usual. He was known for his calm demeanor and firm grip on proceedings, but even he felt the tremor of humanity in that moment. Adjusting his glasses, he cleared his throat and tapped his gavel. "Order," he said, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness. He was not calling the room back to order for formality's sake. It was a reminder to himself as much as to everyone else. He needed to anchor the moment before it carried them all away. On the opposite side, the defense team scrambled to recover. The lead attorney rose with forced confidence, trying to minimize the blow. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. The child is 3 years old. 3. Such words cannot be taken as reliable testimony." His voice rose in pitch, as though volume could erase what had just occurred. But his attempts to dismiss Lily's words only made him sound desperate. The prosecutor, calm yet visibly moved, stood to respond. "Children this young rarely invent such things. Your Honor, they don't concoct lies of this weight. Their words are simple, but their truth is absolute." The child did not hesitate. She did not waver. She pointed directly, without influence. That is not something a courtroom should overlook. Gasps and murmurs swept through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, their pens nearly tearing the paper in their rush to capture every second. Cameras clicked, catching the image of Lily nestled beside Rex, the unlikely duo who had managed to pierce through the thick fog of legal argument and human doubt. Rex's handler, Officer Daniels, stood silently near the corner of the witness stand. His eyes had softened, pride radiating in the way he looked at the dog. He had trained Rex for years, through countless exercises of obedience, detection, and protection, but never had he seen him shine in such a way. Rex had not barked wildly, nor lunged. His simple growl, his posture, and his loyalty had turned him into more than a dog. He had become a silent witness, a protector, and a force of truth. Lily's mother sat a few feet away, her hands clasped so tightly together, her knuckles had turned white. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered silent prayers of gratitude for her daughter's bravery, for Rex's presence, and for the chance that justice might finally be served. Every motherly instinct in her had wanted to protect Lily. From this moment, to shield her from the eyes of strangers, but deep down she knew this was necessary. And now, she saw her daughter's courage shine brighter than she ever imagined. The tension that once suffocated the courtroom began to shift. It was as if Lily's words had unlocked something in the room. Other witnesses who had been hesitant, before neighbors, bystanders, even acquaintances of the defendant, began exchanging glances. They had been afraid to speak up, afraid of retaliation or of their own memories being questioned. But now, they saw that a 3-year-old child had done what grown adults struggled to do: tell the truth without fear. When the recess bell was finally called, the courtroom released a collective breath. People stood, whispering to one another, but their voices carried the same refrain. Did you see her? Did you hear what she said? The story had already begun spreading beyond the walls. What had started as a tense, uncertain trial had just been reshaped into a moment of undeniable humanity. During the break, Lily sat on a bench outside the courtroom, clutching her stuffed bunny. Rex lay at her feet, his massive body stretched across the floor, eyes watchful. Curious reporters lingered nearby, but officers kept them at bay. Lily's mother knelt beside her, stroking her hair. "You were so brave, baby," she whispered. "So very brave." Lily only nodded sleepily, leaning against her mother, unaware of how her voice had changed everything inside that courtroom. Inside, the jurors returned to the deliberation room. With more than just evidence, they carried the weight of Lily's innocence. Some admitted quietly to one another that they hadn't expected much from the child. But now they felt her. Truth settled deep in their hearts. Bad man? 2 simple words that required no embellishment. When court resumed, the prosecutor called the next witnesses. And something extraordinary happened. One by one, people who had once hesitated began to speak. A neighbor described suspicious behavior. Another recalled overhearing troubling remarks. Each testimony, though imperfect, stacked upon the foundation Lily had laid. It was as though her courage had given them permission to finally let go of their fear. The defense tried to punch holes in every statement, but their desperation was evident. The jury wasn't buying it anymore. Each objection, each dismissal, felt weaker than the last. The more they pushed against Lily's words, the more powerful those words became. Rex remained calm throughout, occasionally lifting his head when Lily shifted or when the defendant's voice rose in frustration. His presence seemed to loom larger with each passing moment, a silent reminder of the truth that had already been spoken. As the long day wound to its close, the atmosphere of the courtroom had transformed. The rigid walls that once echoed with sterile legal language now felt charged with something raw, something deeply human. Even the judge, who had spent years distancing himself from emotion in order to uphold the law, found himself deeply moved. He paused longer when addressing Lily, softened his tone when speaking to her, and regarded Rex with a rare sense of respect. By the time evening arrived, it was clear. The trial had shifted irreversibly. The defense no longer held the power they once thought they commanded. The jury no longer viewed the case as a battle of technicalities. They saw it as a story of truth versus deception, courage versus fear. And at the very center of it all was a 3-year-old child and a dog who had said nothing, yet spoken volumes. As court adjourned for the night, Lily was carried out in her mother's arms, Rex faithfully walking beside them. The gallery stood, not out of requirement, but in silent respect. Conversations buzzed quietly, some in awe, others in disbelief, but all acknowledged that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The newspapers the next morning would carry headlines about the child, who pointed to the defendant, and the police dog, who seemed to confirm it. But inside the courtroom, among those who had been present, the moment was etched far deeper than thus. Ink on paper. It was not just about the case. It was about the reminder that truth, when spoken by the smallest of voices, can echo louder than any argument ever could. And as the jury prepared themselves for the final stages of deliberation, one thing was clear. Lily and Rex had broken the silence, and the walls of justice would never be the same again. The gavel struck sharply, echoing through the hushed courtroom like the final toll of a bell. Everyone seemed to hold their breath as the jury foreman stood, a folded slip of paper trembling slightly in his hand. All eyes turned toward him, the weight of days of testimony, tears, and tension pressing down on his shoulders. For a moment, even the fluorescent lights above seemed to hum louder, filling the silence with anticipation. The judge's voice, low but steady, broke the stillness. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman swallowed hard and nodded. We have, Your Honor. Lily's mother clutched her daughter tightly, as though shielding her from the enormity of what was about to be spoken. Rex, the steadfast canine, sat tall at Lily's feet, his amber eyes never once leaving the defendant. Even now, in this moment of judgment, the dog's loyalty and protective instinct radiated like a shield around the little girl. The words came, clear and unshakable. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts. Gasps erupted. Some sobs of relief. Some whispers of disbelief. A sound like a wave swept across the courtroom, crashing against the walls before breaking into silence again. The defendant, who only days ago smirked confidently in his chair, now sat pale, his head lowered as if the walls themselves had closed. In on him, the judge nodded solemnly, confirming the verdict. He turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your service. You have carried the weight of truth, and justice has prevailed. For Lily's mother, the words felt like freedom. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pulled her daughter close, kissing her hair over and over. She whispered words of gratitude, words of love, words of safety she had longed to speak without fear. Lily, too young to fully grasp the enormity of the moment, simply smiled and buried her face against Rex's fur, comforted by the steady beat of his heart beneath her small hands. Rex wagged his tail gently, as though he too understood the significance of the moment. The courtroom's transformation. Something extraordinary happened then, something beyond the reach of laws and verdicts. The courtroom, once a place of tension, transformed into a place of unity. Jurors wept quietly, their hardened expressions dissolving into compassion. Even the judge, usually the embodiment of impartial restraint, removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, as if clearing not just exhaustion, but emotion. Let it be noted, he said, his voice thick with sincerity, that this court has witnessed a rare kind of bravery. Not from seasoned attorneys, nor from the law itself, but from a child and from a dog. The room stilled again. His words weren't typical courtroom procedure. They were human, raw, and true. Reporters scribbled furiously, already sensing this story would ripple beyond the legal world. But the true headline was clear. A 3-year-old and a K9, had shattered the silence of fear and replaced it with truth. The defendant's fall. The defendant was escorted out, chains clinking softly as officers led him away. For the first time, he didn't fight, didn't sneer, didn't protest. He simply walked in silence, the image of Lily pointing at him, her tiny voice calling him a bad man, engraved forever in his memory. That moment, pure and unfiltered, had destroyed the fortress of lies he had built around himself. To the defense attorney, the verdict was a professional loss. But deep down, even he knew the truth had been undeniable. Children that young don't weave complex lies. Dogs don't fabricate instinct. Together, their unspoken bond had revealed what no cross-examination could twist. The heroic bond after the sentencing, the judge did something unusual. He requested Rex be brought forward. The handler gave a small nod, and Rex obediently padded to the bench, his nails clicking softly against the polished floor. The judge leaned forward, his hand trembling slightly as he stroked the dog's head. "This court owes you gratitude," he said softly, though everyone could hear. "Not just for your service today, but for reminding us that justice is not always written in law books. Sometimes it is spoken through loyalty, courage, and the purity of a child's heart." Rex tilted his head as though he understood, then turned back to Lily, settling once more at her feet. The image would stay with everyone who saw it. A little girl clutching her stuffed bunny in one hand, her other hand resting on the strong, steady head of a dog who had helped her find her voice. The world outside, as they stepped out of the courthouse, cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters surged forward, microphones extended, questions flying in rapid succession. How did she know? Was the testimony real? What role did the dog play? Lily's mother shielded her child from the frenzy. "No more questions," she said firmly, holding Lily close. But Lily, innocent and untouched by the chaos of the media, simply looked down at Rex and whispered, "We did it." The handler, standing nearby, smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, you did." And in truth, they had. Against all odds, against fear, against silence, they had spoken. Ripples of change, the case became more than a headline. It sparked conversations in legal circles, in homes, in schools. Could children be better protected in courts? Should therapy animals like Rex be a standard presence for young witnesses? Experts debated, laws were reviewed, and advocates pushed for reform. But beyond policy, the story lived in hearts. Parents held their children a little tighter that night. Officers praised their canine partners with newfound reverence. And across the nation, people remembered that courage doesn't always roar. It sometimes whispers two small words that shake the world. For Lily and Rex, in the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to something resembling normal. Lily began smiling more, laughing freely. Nightmares that once plagued her lessened, soothed by the presence of Rex during therapy visits. The bond between them, formed in a courtroom under the weight of truth, only deepened. One evening, as Lily played in the yard, she looked up at her mother and asked, "Mommy, is the bad man gone forever?" Her mother knelt, brushing hair from her daughter's face. "Yes, baby, he's gone, and you're safe now. You made sure of that." Lily grinned, hugging Rex around the neck. "We're safe," she whispered. The lasting lesson years later, people still spoke of that trial. Law students studied it, lawyers referenced it, judges recalled it. But for Lily, it was simply the story of how, at 3 years old, she had found her voice with the help of a dog who never left her side. And for Rex, it was another mission completed, not with force, not with pursuit, but with loyalty, presence, and the unspoken understanding that sometimes the smallest voices need the strongest guardians. In the end, justice had not just been served, it had been transformed. The world learned that truth doesn't need to be loud, only brave. And sometimes, the bravest truth comes from a child's whisper and a dog's growl.